Thank you for your support of Regent Audio. Each recording in this series was produced by Regent Audio, which owns the copyright. No portion of these recordings may be reproduced for any reason without prior written consent from Regent Audio. For more resources, please visit www.regentaudio.com.
Hey, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for making it. Some of you have come really far away. We're just going to do I'm just going to do a little general welcome here, but then I would actually like us to begin, before we even know who each other is, begin with corporate worship. And please join us as we still ourselves and remind ourselves why we've traveled so far, why we've jumped through the hoops we've jumped through to be here. And I will ask Malcolm to start us off here.
Right. Okay. Shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful singing. Know that the Lord himself is God. It is he who has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, bless his name. For the Lord is good. His loving kindness is everlasting, and his faithfulness to all generations.
Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, early in the morning our song shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down their golden crowns around the glassy sea. Cherubim and seraphim falling down before thee, which words and loves and evermore shall be. Holy, 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 though the darkness hide thee, though the eye of sinful man thy glory may not see. Only thou art holy, there is none beside thee, perfect in power, in love and purity.
Okay, folks, do sit. And this side of the room is A for purposes of reading, and this side is B. First, this. God created the heavens and earth. All you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. God's spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss. God spoke, light.
And light appeared. God saw that light was good, and separated light from dark. God named the light day, and he named the dark night. It was evening, It was morning, day 1.
God spoke, "Sky in the middle of the waters, separate water from water."
God made sky. He separated the water under sky from the water above sky, and there it was. He named the sky the heavens. It was evening. It was morning, day 2.
God spoke, "Separate. Water beneath heaven, gather into one place. Land, appear."
And there it was. God named the land earth. He named the cool water ocean. God saw that it was good.
God spoke, "Separate. Water beneath heaven, gather into one place. Land, appear."
And there it was. God named the land earth. He named the cool water ocean. God saw that it was good.
God spoke, "Earth, green up. Grow all varieties of seed-bearing plants, every sort of fruit-bearing tree."
And there it was. Earth produced green seed-bearing plants, all varieties, and fruit-bearing trees of all sorts. God saw that it was good. It was evening. It was morning, day 3.
God spoke, "Lights, come out. Shine in heaven's sky. Separate day from night. Mark seasons and days and years. Lights in heaven's sky to give light to earth."
And there it was.
God made 2 big lights, the larger to take charge of day, the smaller to be in charge of night. And he made the stars. God placed them in the heavenly sky.
To light up earth and to oversee day and night, to separate light and dark. God saw that it was good. It was evening. It was morning, day 4.
God spoke, "Swarm, ocean, with fish and all sea life. Birds fly through the sky over earth."
God created the huge whales, all the swarm of life in the waters, and every kind and species of flying birds. God saw that it was good.
God blessed them, "Prosper, reproduce, fill ocean. Birds, reproduce on earth."
It was evening. It was morning, day 5.
God spoke, "Earth, generate life, every sort and kind, cattle and reptiles and wild animals, all kinds."
And there it was, wild animals of every kind, cattle of all kinds, every sort of reptile and bug. God saw that it was good.
God spoke, "Let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature, so they can be responsible for the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the cattle, and yes, earth itself, and every animal that moves on the face of earth."
God created human beings. He created them godlike, reflecting God's nature. He created them male and female.
God blessed them. "Prosper, reproduce, fill earth, take charge. Be responsible for fish in the sea and birds in the air, for every living thing that moves on the face of earth."
Then God said, "I've given you every sort of seed-bearing plant on earth, and every kind of fruit-bearing tree, given them to you for food. To all animals and all birds, everything that moves and breathes, I give whatever grows out of the ground for food."
And there it was.
God looked over everything he had made. It was so good, so very good.
It was evening. It was morning, day 6.
Heaven and earth were finished, down to the last detail.
By the 7th day, God had finished his work.
On the 7th day, he rested from all of his work. God blessed the 7th day. He made it a holy day, because on that day he rested from his work. All the creating God had done. This is the story of how it all started, of heaven and earth when they were created.
Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty.
All you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, and inky blackness. God's Spirit brooded it over it like a bird above the watery abyss.
God spoke, "Light."
And light appeared.
God saw that light was good.
Amen.
Welcome to Linlathen 2019, the Poetic Imagination. This is our 6th Linlathen. We're really happy to have you here. And yes, as Kathleen's eyebrows go up in her forehead, it's hard for some of us to believe that we're already at the 6th time that we've gathered here in the summer for such an event. It is actually the coolest weekend we have ever had in Linlathen. We originally decided to hold it in June so that we didn't have the hot August heat. Every year we've had heat records on our weekend in June. Last year it was the hottest weekend on record. And this year we're having it in August. And it's a warm day, but every night it's going to go down cool. And trust me, for those of you who've been here before, this room is like an ice house compared to what it has been in the past. We saved the introduction of Malcolm proper until, I don't know if it'll be a proper introduction, but the introduction of Malcolm until we had more of the rest of you here. And I warned Malcolm that I don't really do your formal Malcolm Guite teaches this, has taught this, has published this, has published that, because my assumption actually, especially with this group, is that most of you are well aware of Malcolm's writings and what he teaches, and as you may be starting to get a sense of, I think it's pretty important that we remember who the person is as well, and that does not get lost in the midst. So Malcolm, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
I think it was about 3 years ago that we first corresponded about Malcolm coming to Linlathen. Yeah. And so it's wonderful to have you here.
Yeah. Sorry it took so long. Yeah.
He's a busy man. In fact, before last night, when Malcolm arrived in late last night, the last time we had engaged in person and talked about this in person was, it was a year and a half ago. I feel like, was it maybe at Christmas time? It was in what station?
In a crowded railway station. Was it Waterloo, I think?
Well, I think that was right. It was Waterloo.
Waterloo.
So I was staying with Ivan and Julie, and Malcolm said, I can meet you in the station. Yeah. So he came running off of one train. We ran to a pub with all your stuff in tow. Had a drink, had a fast chat, and then you ran off and caught the next train. It was a very English experience.
So we wait for different trains, Might have been Paddington. Anyway, yes, that's right.
And we were reflecting last night, remembering we first met in person about 2002, probably, at an ITEA conference in St. Andrews.
Which was, I think, my first. In fact, I think that was my first trip to St. Andrews, which is
really?
an astonishing and beautiful place. Subsequently, because of it here, I did more things, and then happily, my daughter Felicity studied history at St. Andrews.
At St. Andrews as well. Wonderful.
And just graduated a year ago. So
it's a beautiful place.
So
and that
I
was
glad
the second year.
Reminded me, was that 2002? That was a significant
that. It was
thing. I was just beginning to feel my way into some of the thought that eventually became the Faith, Hope and Poetry book. And was just kind of
which is downstairs somewhere.
Working that out.
Okay. Oh, that's quite cool. And it was the, I guess that point, the 3rd year of the Institute of Theology and Imagination and Arts that Trevor Hart and Jeremy Begbie founded, and Stephen Guthrie was one of the first professors as that started with those chaps. He was
you were there,
the linchpin holding us together. So conference. Stephen was actually one of my professors at St. Andrews way back when, and helping host the conferences that Malcolm came up to speak at.
And then I think you co-edited the book that came out of that conference, didn't you? Yeah,
that's right. Yes.
So long roots, but
I feel like we properly got to know each other at the George MacDonald.
Yes, we were both on the George MacDonald committee, the society committee. Oh yeah. So we are fellow committee members, and have engaged in several McDonald's events and conferences together. And the first conference that we both spoke at together actually turned into a book that Bob Trexler published. Bob Trexler published, and I believe is downstairs right now, which is Informing the Inklings. And I'll go ahead and point out and embarrass her that Annie Ferguson helped do some of the copy editing for that book, which is kind of fun. So we have a few fingerprints over that book here in the room. Before we get lost in the exoticness of Africa.
That's puzzling them now.
Yeah, well, maybe I want to make sure that we don't lose that Malcolm actually has an Ontario connection.
Yeah.
Which I only discovered a couple of years ago at
Yeah,
a random meeting at a church in London, at some poetry reading that we ran into in London.
Yeah.
To get, like, London does this.
Yeah, yeah.
But that was when I discovered that your dad was a prophet Mac.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, this, Ontario, you're asking where home is.
Yeah.
I thought I'm going to have to give the short answer, which is Cambridge.
Yeah.
For now. I mean, I was born in Nigeria and brought up there.
Yeah, and I want to go back
But
there.
when I was a 10-year-old, we moved to Hamilton.
Okay.
And I was like a kid
From
in grade
Africa?
school. No, from Cambridge.
Okay,
We'd had
okay.
it. And Dad was a professor of classics at Mac. And I was just like, we lived in Hamilton itself and then in Dundas.
Okay.
And so as I came into my teenage years, I was kind of hiking on the Bruce Trail and, just being a kid in Canada and listening to Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and completely absorbing it all. At which point, I think my dad kind of thought, oh my goodness, he's losing his English identity, which was ironic because I'd hardly ever been in England. But Dad had this very strong sense. So when I was, in 1971, when I was just about to go into, I guess, grade 9 or high school, just leaving junior high, my dad kind of shipped me off to England and I ended up going to a boarding school in North London, which was a very mixed experience. The day school was great. It was as a school, it was academically fantastic, and I had teachers who could really inspire me. But the boarding house was a sort of pretty, dysfunctional place. So I was immensely pleased when I discovered it had ceased to be a boarding house. But so at first, of course, I was coming back. This is the days before cheap flights, so my parents could afford to fly me back after every holiday. But I came back for the summers and for Christmas.
Okay,
and then at Easter, the Easter holidays, I used to be farmed around various relatives in England and Scotland, because I'm half Scots. But so I had this very strange double life in my teenage years of being like a Canadian kid in the long, glorious summers, in kind of Hamilton and Toronto and sailing on the lake and everything. And then suddenly becoming a buttoned-up English schoolboy, sort of transforming mid-Atlantic. And I carried on. I won a scholarship to Cambridge and I started there in, having had a kind of gap year, I started there in 77. And I think 78, 79, I came back still in the summers. Dad was still. But actually, after that, when I graduated in 80, I didn't come back at all. And I mean, I just made my life in England. Yeah. So the summer of 79, which I mentioned in a song somewhere.
Yeah.
I've got a
Of course
song
you
with
do.
the line, I left my mind in Canada around 1979. Still see that rose in Ontario snows, and a love that got frozen in time. Yeah. But anyway, so I just it was hermetically sealed, this Canadian thing. There was nothing else to refer to it. And then, amazingly, with connecting up with Steve Bell and coming out to Regent,
Canada.
Suddenly it sort of unlocked this hermetically sealed Canadian teenagerdom, and I feel great. It makes me feel 15 again.
No, it's wonderful. And
great,
I don't know if it's true for some of you who did not know of Malcolm's Canadian connection, but for me, like that moment in that church in London, it's like all of a sudden my sense of who Malcolm was, this amazing place, suddenly shifted because you all of a sudden had Canada as part of who you are as well. Okay, so let's take that. Let's go all the way back.
Because my dad had joint citizenship of Canadian and British citizenship.
Okay, so tie that in. Take us back to born in Nigeria.
So I was born in my dad, as I've mentioned, is a classicist, which you'd think would be a pretty sedentary occupation, and you'd just be sat there reading Virgil. But for some reason, possibly because of reading Virgil and Homer, my dad had great wanderlust and loved traveling. And so he was teaching classics in Ibadan.
Okay.
And when I was born there in 57. So that was actually just in the last years when Nigeria was making that interesting transition from being a colony to being an independent country. And Dad loved Nigeria and felt that both his faith was being renewed by the liveliness of the Nigerian church, and also that he was being given back the classics, you know, that it's one thing to teach, you know, Homer and Virgil, you know, in sort of the polite drawing rooms of Europe, where, you know, the idea that you might need to talk to the ancestors and that you might have to go and find the Sibyl with the gun, clasp the golden bow, and, you know, had all become refined into mere literary metaphor. Yeah. But Dad said to teach those texts in an animist culture where you know people were really aware of all of that. And happily for Dad, one of his students was Chinua Achebe, who then went on.
Oh,
so
wow.
you know, they really connected, and there was this sense that wow, you know, there are all the problematics of, you know, empire and colony, and my dad was very aware of that. But there was also this tremendous gift and connection and mutuality where suddenly the taken for granted European poetry comes alive again in a new thing. So, I mean, unfortunately, I was too young to appreciate all of that, you know, as a little kid.
It's part of your DNA.
But I felt there was, you know, I knew that there were exciting things happening there. So we were there, and then we moved to Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was then. And that led us into, at that time, Smith was in charge of it, and it was a pretty grim sort of regime. Ian Smith was trying to make it more and more like South Africa. But again, because Rhodesia, you know, had a governor general, they couldn't actually enact explicitly racist laws like South Africa did. But they were doing it by all kinds of other means, you know, educational bars, and you had to have so many O-levels to vote. But then, you know, you couldn't get the qualification if you could sit the exam, but nobody would teach you the syllabus. Right. So lots of sort of liberal whites like my parents used to teach in schools in the shanty towns, so that you know, kids could take the exams and then, you know, have a political voice. But then, as you may know, the Smith regime declared and made a unilateral declaration of independence, and split off and put the Governor General under house arrest. And so we were there in that crisis. Wow. And my father very strongly felt that the Smith regime was then not the legitimate government, and you know, couldn't command his allegiance, or anybody who, as it were, had an allegiance to the sovereign. And they used to do, my parents used to do house visits to the Governor General, which meant that they were marked people. And in the end, there was quite a lot of sort of political violence actually at that time, and when it became known that my father was a strong opponent of the regime, and also they almost immediately began to interfere in university affairs. And because the university wouldn't resist the government, my father resigned his post. So then my sister and I began to be bullied at school, and eventually somebody put a bomb in our garden, and a sort of petrol bomb. So my father sent my mother and my sister and I away to England to, just for safety, also because he felt we were hostages to fortune, and he wanted to resist the government, which he did entirely passively. I mean, he'd been, he was been a conscientious objector in the war, but he got together with a bunch of radical Catholic nuns and started kind of helping. The government was doing mass arrests of African trades union leaders and things like that. So my dad and these nuns were kind of helping them to get to safety and stuff like that. So to cut a long story short, my father was arrested, and they basically expelled him from the country. So we had to leave stuff behind. So he became a political refugee. Happily, his college in Cambridge, St. Catherine's, sort of was there to help, and they gave us a house in Cambridge for about 6 months or so, until Dad got the job in Canada. So,
wow. So a traumatic arrival.
So my first name, I mean, everybody calls me Malcolm, but my first name is actually Ayodeji, which is a Yoruba name. Ayo means joy, and Deji means again. It's the second joy. It's a name for a second child.
in that weaving and getting you as far as Canada, you've mentioned your father, the classicist, but I know because of things I've heard you say that your mother, I don't know if she herself is a poet, but she is a repository
Oh yeah,
of
absolutely.
poetry,
yeah,
like
no, my
nothing
mother,
else.
you know, I think of my father as, I mean, my father is, is a very learned man. He's also a very conscientious man. He didn't particularly, share the classical poetry at home. I mean, he was at his most unbuttoned at home. He'd be sitting and playing a piano, and we'd sing old, we used to stand around the piano and sing, sort of tell me the stories of Jesus. But my mother, is a Scotswoman.
Whereabouts in Scotland?
So Dumbarton.
Okay.
From my earliest childhood, my mother just naturally recited poetry, such that, I mean, she didn't sit me down in a chair and say, now this is poetry and it's good for you, I mean, she just would come up with it. So, just as an instance, because of living in Africa, Dad had a long leave and you didn't stay through the hot summer, so we went back to England every year, and my mother wouldn't fly. So my father would fly and set up house, usually in Cambridge, but sometimes elsewhere. And then we would go by sea over 2 or 3 weeks with my mother. And so a lot of my best memories as a child are being at sea. And in those days, going along the coasts of Africa, there'd still be the little trading schooners, sailing boats as well. So I remember, on the deck with my mother at the age of about 5, and I was saying, look at that lovely white-sailed ship. I wonder where it's going, And my mother would put her arm around me and gesture towards it and say, "Whither, O splendid ship, thy white sails crowding, leaning across the bosom of the urgent west, that fearest nor sea rising nor sky clouding? Whither away, fair rover, and what thy quest?" And I go, whoa. What was that? But it was just, and she'd recite bits. We'd sit and look at the boat going out. It was always an exciting moment when the boat left the shore and you'd see the furrow, made by the thing widening out and the land receding, and she'd go, "The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free." And she wouldn't say, "Now that's Coleridge. Later in life, he's going to be really important to you." It meant that when I finally found Coleridge, that was the stuff my mother had said to me. So she was a great fond of poetry, and I thought everybody's mother did that. And she never, spoke of learning poetry, but she seemed to have it there.
Where did that come from?
And that came from her mother and her father, because her mother was a poet. Her mother was I think, she's quite a considerable poet. So her mother, my granny Ginty, published 2 volumes of poetry in Glasgow in the early 20th century. I think one in 1918, which was the year my mother was born, and one in 1922, a book called The Shipmakers and Other Verses, and another one, a really interesting cycle of poems called The Legendary of St Mungo.
Oh,
which
cool.
was
Who's
about
the patron saint? Well,
so Mungo is
one of
Kentigern's, one of the
Scotland's.
patron saints of Glasgow, and it's the story of the meeting of Colum and Kentigern. And it's a fabulous, long before it was the trendy thing to do Celtic Christianity, she was completely absorbing this. And it's a very beautiful sequence, but it has a wonderful scene in it where Mungo and Colum meet, each with their own sort of troops of disciples. And it's one of those encounters between Celtic saints where this could be great or this could go wrong, And what she has is they when they meet, she has all of Mungo's disciples, if you like, the Scots, singing the praises of Colum and the Irish, and all of the Irish Colum's disciples singing the praises of Mungo, which was a very deliberate thing because Glasgow, as you know, was a sectarianly divided town, and the kind of Protestant Catholic thing was also divided against the Scots.
Irish and Scots.
And Scots.
Very much.
And she was trying to take back. And then in this poem, she has the 2 monks collectively have a vision of the future of Scotland. And on the sort of pristine banks of the Clyde, they see the industry and they see the shipyards and they foresee the sectarian tensions and they're praying against it. It was an amazing sort of poem. So my grandmother, as I say, was also full of poetry and wrote and published poetry. And she was a strong influence on my mother, but so was my grandfather, my mother's father, who had been an inspector. He was been a musician and a writer, but his last job, he'd been an inspector of schools for the Highlands and Islands. So he'd gone right up and down the Highlands and Islands and the sort of Hebridean Islands, which is where he met my grandmother.
Okay.
But there was a bit of a sort of shock to everybody's systems because my grandfather had grown up, you know, was in the last, he was, you know, in his 50s or, you know, last go, you know, before he would have retired. at
You
60.
got that, folks? Once we hit our 50s, we're in the last go.
No, well, it wasn't the
Thanks,
last go.
Malcolm.
Everybody thought, and he was a widower. You know, he had grown-up children, he had 2 grown-up daughters. You know, his wife had died. He was a widower. He was doing this job, and he went up. It was in his late 50s, I guess. He inspected a school, a Highland school, at which my grandmother was a teacher, and fell in love with her. And she fell in love with him, and there was like a kind of, you know, generational gap. So they had a whirlwind romance, and to the immense disapproval of both families, they got married, and produced my mother and my uncle in fairly short order. And then he retired. And so my grandmother is a very unusual household. My grandmother was the working person who went to school to work. And my grandfather, for the last 10 years of his life, he died when my mother was 10 or 9 or 10. My grandfather did all the rearing of the children. And he had a very strong theory educationally that children should be exposed to the best literature from the cradle, that there should be no filters, no graded vocabularies, no adult deeming what was appropriate. So my mother had Milton and Herbert and Shakespeare just literally read to her in the cradle while she was an infant. And he gave her very early, more or less as soon as she could read, he gave her the Oxford Book of English Verse and sort of read it aloud with her again and again, was at home all the time. So my mother and my uncle Bill, who went on to be an English professor and write about John Donne, just absorbed poetry, you know, as it were, with their mother's milk, but mainly from this much older father. And so when my sister and I were born, my mother just took the same view, and my dad, you know, was perfectly happy with that. So I also had
you had
Milton
no
and
hope.
Shakespeare,
You had no chance for anything
read
other.
in the cradle, and my mother just naturally produced this stuff.
Yeah.
So it was quite a shock when I eventually, you know, was sent to school. That I would say, oh, you know, you're that great. Nobody knew this stuff. I thought that's really weird. I thought everybody had this, you know. So I now realise how lucky I was, you know.
To be seeped.
And so
language and imagery.
later when I discovered that there was a subject at school called English, where you read poetry and books, I thought, how can that be work? Like, that's what I do when nobody else is hassling me to do anything else. So I always regarded that as a kind of free period, really. It's kind of,
I think that's a wonderful setup to walk us into your lecture. We'll come back in the week, and I'm going to poke you with some more questions, more introductory questions. But I think that poetic setup is a wonderful setup for your Kirstin, the Poetic Imagination.
Good.
So let's move you into that.
Yeah, I think I'd rather sort of be standing rather than sedentary for this. So I think we are looking at the whole thing about the Inklings and the poetic imagination, but I wanted to start with a lecture which I've called Christ in the Poetic Imagination, but really to begin with simply some account of what the poetic imagination is, how we might come to understand it, so that we can then open out how it works with the Inklings. And you've got a handout which has got some bits of Shakespeare and the Scottish poet Edwin Muir, and a poem of my own at the end. But you'll probably know some of these things anyway. So I want to start really with an account. We'll bring in some theology in a minute, but I want to start with a poet's account of poetry. And, you know, there's no point in messing around with literary middle management. We may as well go straight to the top and ask Shakespeare, what is this thing? Poetry, how does it work? And I delight in, and I'm sure many of you already know, the wonderful account of poetry itself, which Shakespeare gives in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which he slips, as it were, into a speech by Theseus, Duke Theseus, right towards the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream at the beginning of Act 5. And it's a very interesting, the context of the passage in Shakespeare which has the famous description, we're going to look at in a minute, the famous description, the poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth. The context is quite interesting because Shakespeare puts this beautiful account, this kind of little invitation for us to look through the window into his own poetic workshop and see what it is he does and how he does it. He slips this account, which in itself is not only a description but also a defense of poetry. He slips it into the mouth of a hostile witness, because in the context of the play, Theseus, who is very much seems to have the character of a down-to-earth, practical, no-nonsense, don't trouble me with poetry, the imagination, sort of practical, English bluff Englishman who just happens to be a mythical duke in Athens for the purpose of the play. Theseus is dismissing poetry, dismissing the imagination, trying to say that the thing he's just been told couldn't possibly be true. Except that he dismisses poetry, in the most beautiful poetry. So we begin to realize there's some ironies. So just a quick summary of the context. I expect most of you, I'm sure all of you know Midsummer Night's Dream, but just to remind you, you may remember that the whole play is about marriage. The whole play is about how ill-thoughted or apparently opposed or previously at enmity people and elements in whom there is a difference that could be a quarrel, and in certain cases, like Theseus and Hippolyta, who were at war before the play, has been a quarrel, can find a reconciliation, how the apparent contradictions can turn out to be complementary. And it starts with them looking up at the moon and anticipating their marriage, Duke Theseus and Hippolyta, the Amazon queen, right? Then suddenly we get the younger generation coming in, and these four pairs of ill-sorted lovers who are in a complete mess with each other, and it's all, I love her, but she doesn't love me because she loves him, and he used to be my best friend, but I hate him because she loves him, and all, it's, the usual stuff of undergraduate university life. Theseus and Hippolyta, Theseus gives an awful speech at the beginning in which he's telling, everybody who they ought to love, and, threatening terrible punishments if they don't love the right person, and trying to do everything cack-handedly and top-handedly and down on them. And they are not having any of that. So they all run off into the woods. Because although this play is set and the daylight scenes are in the kind of beautiful, daylit, rational, beautifully architraved scenery of Athens, the seat of reason, curiously enough, just behind the Parthenon, as it were, up on a little, there happens to be a beautiful patch of enchanted English woodland, full of obviously English characters like Puck, Robin Goodfellow, and English fairies like Oberon and Titania. And so the lovers all, rush off to the woods, and then by a series of enchantments, largely by the mischief of Puck, in the almost dreamscape of these moonlit woods, a kind of imaginarium, a kind of safe zone. They pretty much get to try out, according to who wakes up and sees who with the magic potions and so on, they pretty much get to try out experimentally every possible combination of sort of who loves who and who doesn't love who, and, until finally they get it sorted. And they actually wake up, sorted out, with, each person loving the person they were supposed to love and happily in love and friends with each other. So the whole problem, which Theseus had tried to resolve by oppressive force, is worked through magically and resolved from within itself. And so they come back in after their adventures, and Theseus and Hippolyta know nothing about this. They're in the Athens scenes. But clearly what's happened off stage is, before this passage begins, is that the lovers must have told Theseus and Hippolyta all about their magical adventures and how fantastic it all was, and how they, there was Puck, and there was Oberon and Titania, and there was, all of this. And Act 5 begins with Theseus and Hippolyta walking on and thinking about what they've just been told. And Hippolyta says, 'tis strange, my Theseus, that these lovers speak of. And Theseus replies, more strange than true. I never may believe these antique fables nor these fairy toys. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold, that is the madman. The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. Kind of, if you're in the audience at this point, you want to say, Theseus, you're in a hole, stop digging. Because it's one thing to say, oh, you know, madmen see this. But if you're about to say, trouble with people in love, you know, they think the girl is great, but actually she's really quite ugly. So you are saying this to your fiancé. Don't go there. You know, but he keeps going, oh, you know. The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in the brow of Egypt. So just in a couple of lines, he's dismissed the lunatic and he's dismissed the lover. And now he's about to dismiss the poet. And if we were following form, he'd dismiss the poet in a line, wouldn't he? But suddenly, Shakespeare opens the thing up. So you know, the lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such strict tricks hath strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. Can you feel the difference in tone between what he says about the lunatic and the lover and what he says about the poet? And so although ostensibly he's trying to say, poetry, there's nothing in that, you know, move on, nothing to see here. In fact, even in this apparent dismissal, he's giving us this wonderful and great account of poetry. And what I want to do is kind of open that out. But just to finally, just to highlight there's a sort of three ironic undercuttings of what Theseus has to say, where Shakespeare is having a little bit of fun and inviting his audience to have a little bit of fun at the expense of his character. So, first of all, Theseus says, I never may believe these antique fables, right? So this is Theseus, who went through the maze and took Ariadne's thread and defeated the Minotaur. So I think he's pretty much an antique fable, is he not? He says, I don't believe these antique. I mean, he's marrying an Amazon queen, you know? But he says, you don't want to believe any of these antique fables, except I am one. And then he says, nor these fairy toys. Well, we're told, if you remember in the play, when Oberon and Titania, the fairy king and the fairy queen, meet up because they've quarreled about the little changeling child, basically, it's one of those embarrassing and awkward moments where they both sneaked over to be in Athens for Theseus and Hippolyta's wedding, right? But neither of them has told the other that they're going to do that. So they meet up in the woods and they both go, awkward, what are you doing here? And we're told then that the reason why Titania is there is to bless Theseus's marriage bed, because once, when Theseus was a teenager, she led him through the glimmering wood. So that's interesting, isn't it? This bluff, practical, no-nonsense, don't believe any of that fairy stuff, is somebody who sometime in his adolescence actually met the fairy queen and was led through the glimmering wood and has clearly just crushed that. Just, you know, as C.S. Lewis says in The Weight of Glory, taken revenge on the callings of beauty by calling it adolescence. But maybe there's more, you know, maybe there's more to it. So he says, don't believe these fairy toys, but he himself, in fact, has encountered the fairies. And then he says, so I don't believe a word of anything these people say. And of course, then he says you don't want to believe poetry, and he does the whole thing in the most beautiful poetry in iambic pentameters. So there are your three underminings. Also, of course, we know, because we've seen it happen on the stage, that in the world of the play, everything that the lovers tell him off stage did happen. So we know he's wrong. And I haven't given it here, but Hippolyta makes a very interesting reply to Theseus's attack on the story as having been merely a figment of the imagination. His understanding of the imagination is merely about the fictive and the non-true, rather than as bearing a deeper truth. So she says, but all the story of the night told o'er, and all their minds transfigured so together, more witnesseth than fancy's images, and grows to something of great constancy. Isn't that interesting? She says, well, let's just leave it for a moment. Did any of that stuff actually happen? Well, whether or not it did happen, it had an effect. They were in trouble and ill-sorted, and now they're harmonized and ready for marriage. They've all somehow been transfigured together. And the story is not a dead thing that's just an accumulation of false facts, you know, that the sort of thought police of Theseus can't sift and, you know, wouldn't have seen anything if they'd been there with a camcorder. The story is like a living thing. It's growing. It grows to something of great constancy, but howsoever strange and admirable. So that's the context in the play. Now, what I'd like to do is just focus on those keywords about the poet's eye and the glance and imagination bodying forth, because it seems to me to go to the heart of what the poetic imagination is. But before I focus on the actual description of the poet, I'd also just like to draw your attention, it's why I've given this slightly longer, that the account of poetry that begins the poet's eye and fine frenzy rolling and finishes with a local habitation and a name, those classic key lines are framed in this speech by lines in which two different words, two words that we might want to think of as contrary, but also might be complementary, are framed, and which Shakespeare repeats. He puts both words together and repeats them twice, once before this description of poetry and once after. So they kind of, I think, give us a sort of interpretative frame or network. And those two words are both about ways of knowing. And the two words are apprehend and comprehend. So we have the idea of shaping fantasies. Shaping is a word that comes again, really interesting. The imagination is a shaping fantasy, which apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends, right? Now, when Theseus says that, he's trying to say, yeah, and what they apprehend is just wishy-washy, nothing. We only exist in the world of comprehension. But that's not what the language says. The language says precisely the opposite. The language says there is a moreness to things. There are things that we can only apprehend and not comprehend. And then again, those two words are repeated afterwards. If it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. Okay? Now, just to think about those two words, apprehend and comprehend, because they're really crucial words. So you hear the middle bit that's the same, talking about, I have to, the shade of my father here, giving me, whenever I didn't know a word, my father would immediately take me back to the Latin, and give me lots of other examples of it. So the prehend bit of things is about being able to take hold of something, right, and grasp it. So I don't know if you ever did when you were doing sort of science or zoology as kids in school, whether you were told that there were certain kinds of monkeys that had a prehensile tail. So their tail, they could actually pick stuff up with their tail. I remember being taught that and think, that would be so useful. I mean, particularly now that I travel a lot and I have my stick and I have, if I had a prehensile tail, it would be just great. So you can see what prehend means from the meaning of prehensile tail. So apprehend and comprehend, basically, if you think about it, apprehend is where you can reach out and you can get a bit of something. You can begin to pick it up, but you haven't got the whole thing. You've just got a bit of it. Comprehend is a comprehensive word. It includes everything. To comprehend is to get your mind right around something. And therefore, in order to fully comprehend, to fully comprehend something, that something has got to be within the reach of your mind. So in that sense, your mind at the moment of comprehension is larger than the thing itself. Right? But there are many, many things which are greater than the measure of man's mind. And therefore, there is much that we can only apprehend, but which we can perhaps, after an initial apprehension, move towards comprehension, bring a little bit more closely into comprehension. Rather, as we say, that theology is fides quaerens intellectum, that it's faith seeking understanding, that we have an apprehension of things, a kind of gift of grace, of awareness of things, and then we gradually begin to comprehend them a bit more. But it works the other way around as well, of course, because we can start with having comprehended something, and then we realize the very terms of our comprehension themselves bring in new apprehensions. You know, and if I can quote a line of one of my own poems, we discover that explanation deepens mystery. That the very terms of the explanation we've been given call forth new mysteries, and you have some sense. So one might almost think of it as being like a spectrum between apprehend and comprehend as ways of knowing, and they're repeated twice. The other, of course, sense in which we have the word comprehend, which may be useful as well, and may even be being echoed, is the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not, is one translation, rather than did not overcome it. This was too great a thing for the darkness ever entirely to contain. Yeah? So apprehend and comprehend are there. And I think they therefore affect the way we hear the other twice repeated thing. We have apprehend, comprehend, repeated. Comprehend, apprehend, comprehend. And then, in the actual description of poetry, we have heaven and earth and heaven. Yeah? And you can see how that might work. Let's just look now at the actual passage. So, the poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. So the first thing to say about this, if we think of this as really Shakespeare letting you in on the secret, in, you know, what the poetry actually is it's quite counterintuitive. You think, being a poet and being a person who works with words, he'd take you straight to the poet's pen, or at least to the poet's tongue. But he doesn't. He takes you to the poet's eye. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance. So, at the beginning and at the end, this is about vision. It's about seeing. Even the words themselves in the end, it's not the words that count. It is the vision. Glorious, as somebody says, you know, how do we see? What do we see? How can we, what kind of seeing is involved? So the poet has a glance. And where is the glance? So the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. So the first thing to say is, well, that's pretty inclusive and comprehensive, isn't it? That's, you know, Shakespeare's idea of poetry is that everything, if you think of the heavens and the earth, that's a way of saying everything, isn't it? In fact, we say in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without void, you know. Or we say the Nicene Creed, I believe in God, creator of heaven and earth, and then, almost as it were, to open out what that means, of all things visible and invisible. That the heavens are precisely that area of that which we don't fully know and comprehend, but which glimmers through everything, which we apprehend, which is invisible, perhaps just beginning to become visible. The earth is what we can comprehend and get our minds around. So can you see how the apprehend, comprehend? And if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. It's always apprehending more than reason can comprehend, and yet there must be a connection. How that's somehow reflected in doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. So, just as a sort of, I'm going to occasionally lift my eyes from the Shakespeare and its context and just talk about our own context and poetry, because it's quite helpful to reflect on what we think is the legitimate realm or subject matter, or as it were, métier of poetry itself. And clearly for Shakespeare, nothing is barred, nothing is ruled out. You can write as much about the earth as you like, but you can also write about heaven. And if you're going to do this well, you really need to have both. You have to glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. So the divine, the mysterious, the beautiful, the spiritual, the given in Revelation are all proper subjects of poetry. But also so is the earth and the clods and the pebbles and, you know, the brooks and everything like that that's in the earth. And all that is earthy in us is a proper subject for poetry, and all that is heavenly in us is a proper. Well, Shakespeare was very fortunate, because if you look even now, you know, particularly look at sort of secular high-end poetry in the world, certain subjects do seem to be kind of banned. You know? There are things you can talk about, not. The person who first realised this was happening, you know, after the Second World War, I think particularly, was the poet Stephen Spender, and he wrote a really interesting essay in which he talks about how the traditional image, iconic, almost symbolic image of the poet, archetypal image of the poet, is of a bird. The bird that sings in the tree, or the bird that flies. You know, and there's often, Milton talks about himself in his blindness in Paradise Lost as the bird in shadiest covert hid that sings darkling. So Spender in this essay says, once the bird was like Milton's darkling bird, or to go to another darkling, like Keats's nightingale. And the point about Keats's nightingale is that even though it sings first in the tree, it goes, he hears it moving further and further up the valleys. Whither is it fled? You know, do I wake or sleep? Or, you know, Milton talks about his muse. He says that with no middle flight intends to soar, you know, and speak of the heavens as well as the earth. So Spender says, isn't that great? We can all be like birds, except this. And this is what he says. He says, now, in our culture, particularly in the way our culture has rejected that whole realm, the bird is in a cage. And the bars of the cage, this is a brilliant image. He said, the bars of the cage in which we've imprisoned the bird of the poetic muse and the poetic imagination, the bars of the cage are made of mirror turned inwards. And the only legitimate subject for the poet now is fragmented images of self. That it's all about that kind of broken, and you know, and you can understand the breakup of all the big certainties and the great meta-narratives, and all of that's gone, and you can see Eliot saying in The Wasteland, you know, these fragments I have shored against my ruin. But he didn't stay, you know, in the cage, but people had a go at him when he left it. In fact, that essay of Spender's is quoted magnificently in Dorothy Sayers' splendid essay, The Poetry of Search and the Poetry of Statement, where, do you know that essay? Okay, it's just so good. So in that essay, she says, look, there's really two quite different kinds of poetry. There's the poetry where you're feeling your way into things and wandering and searching and full of your apprehensions. And then there's a poetry where you say, look, I found something. So Dorothy Sayers splendidly says, if the woman in the parable who had, you remember, who lost her coin, and we're told that she swept the whole house and she searched everywhere, and that when she found the lost coin, she called in her neighbors and said, rejoice with me, I have found my coin. So she said if she was a poet, what she did in the parable was she was a poet of statement. She did the looking first, and then when she'd found the coin, she said, rejoice with me, I have found my coin. But Dorothy says if she'd been a modern poet of search, she would have set off a loud lament as soon as she'd lost the coin. It would have been a beautiful elegy for the lostness of the lost coin. Oh, my coin is lost. And the neighbors would have started to come in and say, wow, that's pretty poetic. And she'd say, I'm going to search for my coin. And she would have given you, look, she would have said, oh, it's really dusty under here. You know, the dust lies thick upon the dead. Oh, my God, a spider. Why was spider? You know, and she would have, like, told you all about it. And there would have been, you know, 5 or 6 books of poetry before she ever found the coin. You know, it not necessarily would have been bad poetry. It might have been quite good poetry. But Dorothy says the trouble is, you know, we're only allowed to look for the coin. We're not allowed to find it. And so she uses Eliot as an example. And she says Eliot was being a poet of search in The Wasteland. but he was being a poet of statement in the four quartets. I mean, there's lots of searches as well. And then people were, she was writing at a time when people were rejecting the four quartets. I mean, people would now say. So, and then she quotes the Stephen Spender and says, we've trapped. And when I say the poets, I mean, for this read, the writers of fiction, you know, the makers of films, the writers, you know, that somehow it's legitimate to talk about these fragmented images, but not legitimate to go beyond them. And that can actually be quite destructive. I mean, if you think about, I mean, you know, this could start a long conversation, but I wonder sometimes, you know, I think about an incredibly gifted poet like Sylvia Plath, and you think how, you know, it's necessary, I think, was necessary part of Plath's poetic development that she should indeed deal with this quite dark sort of psychic matter and, you know, talk about it. But you look at critics like A. Alvarez and others who kind of encouraged Plath down that path. You know what I mean? They wanted more of that. They were saying the darker and more fragmented and trapped and inner and irredeemable your poetic matter is, the more authentic it is in some sense. And that she wasn't able to kind of, you know, she wasn't encouraged to allow that same poetic gift to see the other things as well. You know, Seamus Heaney talks in his great Nobel Prize acceptance speech about how for years, he says, I was constrained by the dolorous circumstances. My tells about the troubles, you know. I was like a monk bent over his prie-dieu, looking down and only contemplating the murderous. And he said, there came a time in my life when I had to straighten up. And I had to make room in my life and my imagination for the marvelous as well as the murderous. It's not that you didn't talk about the murderous as well, but, you know. So, sorry, there's a bit of a diversion from the text here. So, returning, the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth to heaven. Maybe the heavenly side is being, as it were, filtered out or forbidden in some ways. And therefore, when we return to it in the earlier poetry, it has a kind of thrill of discovery and possibility. And it will certainly return, I think, to poetry. But if we think of earth and heaven, heaven and earth, as also heaven and earth and heaven, as also representing this movement between the apprehended, the invisible, creator of all things visible, and the comprehended. If we think just heaven and earth in those terms, rather than in strictly theological terms, as emblems of the airy nothing and of the thoroughly known, you can see a way of looking at poetry as starting in one of those two places, heaven or earth. But before we do that, let's just look at what he goes on to say about the glance. The poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And here's the key. This is the absolute core of what Shakespeare has to offer us here. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Absolutely astonishing language. So the first thing to notice is what he says there. He finally brings the word imagination in, which is our whole subject. Imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. When I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, you know, we were being taught the kind of vocabulary you're supposed to use when you're writing proper literary essays. And the buzzword in my day, I'm sure there are many buzzwords since, but the buzzword in my day was juxtaposition. As long as you used the word juxtaposition at some point, it was a proper essay and you got a 2-1, you know. But if you failed to use the word juxtaposition, you were naive and you only got a 2-2. So I am now going to legitimate this entire discourse by using the word juxtaposition. So juxtaposition, the jutting up against, the putting next to each other of two things. So the real core and heart of this whole account of poetry is in the juxtaposition of the two words imagination and bodies, because they're not at all what you would expect. Imagination, it is the imagination itself which does the bodying forth. Now, if I were a speaker or a lecturer of a certain kind, which I'm not, but if I could, theoretically, at this point in the lecture, divide you into two groups, right? to do sorts of little buzz groups and free word association. And I could say to this group, well, you guys have got the word imagination, you know, and you guys have got the word bodies. And you would all turn to your neighbors and say all the words that you associate with imagination, and you guys would say all the words with bodies, and then I'd ask you to report back, and it would just be toe-curlingly embarrassing, so I'm not going to do it. But if I did do it, just imagine, I'm guessing that the kind of things we freely associate with the word imagination would be fairly disembodied, actually, that they would be all the kind of airy-fairy, beautiful, diaphanous, self-winged things flitting in and out of the moths and the starlight and the rainbow unicorns, and they would be kind of slightly disembodied and diaphanous. And obviously, over here, the exciting bodies group, of course, you'd be thinking about how to interpret the word bodies itself. You know, is this a plural noun, or is it, as here, a verb in the present continuous? But I'm guessing it would be very embodied and earthy, and it would be either about you know, beautiful rippling muscles and gracious statuesque curves, or perhaps more likely it would be about sweat and you know, arthritic knees and you know, but it would all be that physicality. We wouldn't naturally associate these two words. So Shakespeare does a remarkable thing in saying imagination, bodies. And bodies here is not, you know, as I say, it's not a noun in the plural, it's a verb. And it's a verb in the present continuous. Imagination is always bodying. Imagination is seeking to body forth, to put into body the things it has apprehended. And you can therefore see precisely what's going on in the heaven, earth, heaven thing. So imagination apprehends, and what it apprehends is something that is seeking form, something that may be expressionless or wordless or formless, which is seeking form. And so imagination says form must be embodied. It can't be just imagined. So imagination bodies forth form. Wonderful. The poet, the actual language of the poetry itself becomes wonderfully kind of tactile, forth form. You know, the imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. And what kind of body is it giving? And turns then finally, after the bodying, the poet's pen gets a look in. Do you see how many stages? We've had vision, we've had apprehension, we've had bodying forth, we've had form. Now the pen can come in. Then the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives, as a gift here, to airy nothing, a local habitation and a name. So what's being made here is a habitation, a place you can dwell in, and a noble name, a name. The name then becomes the great summoning of what otherwise would have been unknown. I should say in passing, just to have one more dig at poor old Theseus, that in the play and in this speech and in the conversation with Hippolyta, Theseus sets himself as the guy who stands up for reason and logic over against all this airy-fairy imagination, right? But do you notice in his attempt to disprove the validity of poetry by his logic, he makes a really classic logical error. He says that the poet's eye in fine frenzy doth glance from heaven to earth, as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. So the poet's got hold of some things that we don't know yet. We only apprehend, we don't comprehend, right? And has found the form and the body which will make them knowable, yeah? So the thing that is being bodied forth is a thing unknown, right? But do you see the little slip, the little weasel change of pseudo-logic and false argument, where he says, gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name? How is it that thing unknown has now become no thing? That's just completely illegitimate reasoning. Just because a thing is unknown doesn't mean it's nothing. That's the whole point about expanding knowledge, whether you do it by the exercise of reason and science, or whether you do it by using the imagination as your truth-bearing faculty and your means of exploring. You're precisely trying to move into the unknown and make the unknown known. But people who like to have everything tight and sorted out often assume that if they don't know it, it isn't there. But but because a thing is unknown does not mean it's airy nothing. On the contrary, there's a great, great early poem by Seamus Heaney called The Forge, which is ostensibly a description of the door of an old forge, an old blacksmith shop. But the opening line of this poem is, "All I know is a door into the dark," which is just, and the whole book is called A Door into the Dark. It's one of the most beautiful things you can say about knowledge. Everything I know brings me to the frontier of knowledge. That's what it is. And it's a door into the dark. And in the dark, there may be other things that I need to know, and I may need poetry to help me know what they are. So whatever is being given, bodied forth and given a local habitation and name here, is not, in spite of Theseus's specious elision of terms, is not airy nothing. It's a thing unknown, which is in the very process of being made known. And we find this again and again, do we not, in the poetry that we love, that we've half felt something, we've vaguely apprehended something, we've experienced poetry as, or we experienced what Eliot calls peripheral vision. Poetry is kind of, and then suddenly this poet gives us this line and we go, oh, that's it. Now I have that forever in that poem. Now I have a local habitation and a name for this very thing. Yeah? Now, just to say something about heaven to earth, earth to heaven, I really like the double trajectory that Shakespeare offers for poetry. That it could start at the heavenly, that is to say the invisible, the apprehended, I don't even have a name for this, I don't have a body for this yet, I don't have a form, but I have an apprehension. Glance from heaven. It can start like that and then find one form or body after another. That's one way of doing it. But the other way of doing it is to glance from earth to heaven and to say there's just something about that tree that I'm drawn to, and I'm just going to write a poem about this tree, and I'm not going to ask myself anything else except how can I do this tree? I love this thing on earth. And in the very act of describing it, suddenly it puts forth all kinds of other branches and bears all kinds of other fruit, and it turns out to be that blessed is the man who's like a tree planted by the waters, and it suddenly becomes an image of the tail tree and the roots of language. But you started off just with thinking of it as a tree, okay? And you can actually see these different kinds of poetry. You can think of the range of your great poets. You can see some poets whose whole métier is to start with the apprehended and move to the comprehended, to start with what Theseus would dismiss as airy nothing, but is for them a thing unknown, and gradually find form for it. You can see poets who start the other way around. So just again, among modern poets, T.S. Eliot, I would say, on the whole, is a poet who starts with the glance to heaven and then keeps finding the earthy. You get this all the time. So he has this idea, you can hardly put it into words, and then he's looking for one image after another. I mean, and that's true in his early poetry as well. If you think of Eliot saying, I must borrow every changing shape to find expression, dance like a dancing bear, chatter like an ape, or I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. But even when he gets into the great Christian poetry in the four quartets, he keeps telling you that he's tried to do it, but he hasn't quite done it yet. He's got this thing. We cannot say what it is. I can't say, faith, it would be faith and wrong. Can't say, the faith and the hope and the love are all in the waiting. Or he gives you a beautiful passage of poetry, which any other poet would just say, yes, my life is complete. I've written these lines. And Eliot writes them, then he adds, like immediately afterwards goes, that was a way of putting it, a periphrastic study in a worn-out poetical mode, But for us, there's only the trying. He said, well, it was a bloody good try, mate, But he's saying, I still haven't got it. I still haven't quite put it the way I need to put it. So you've got these apprehensions, and they're continually, he's trying one body after another to find the form. That's Eliot's way of writing. It's a great way of writing. If you want a poet who totally starts with the earth and loves the earth and doesn't want to be transcendent at all, and yet who nevertheless opens out the earthly thing in such a way that it becomes a local habitation and a name for all kinds of apprehensions that you really needed to have a home for, then without question, in terms of contemporary poets, that's Seamus Heaney, whom I've already alluded to. If you think about the Seamus Heaney poem that everybody knows, and which he thought was like his first good poem, his first actual poem, this is a poem and not just a note in my exercise book, and which opens his first volume, The Death of a Naturalist. So if you think about the poem Digging, right? So that is a poem which starts off, it starts off with the classic problem of, oh golly, I'm a poet and I'm supposed to write a poem and I'm sat here and like, what do I do, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun, oh, what am I going to do? And then he's distracted and he kind of hears the rasping sound of a spade outside the window. And he looks out and there's his dad digging. And suddenly he starts writing about digging, and boy does he know about digging, and he uses the most earthly language you can think about, the squelch and slap of potato peat and the cool cuts and the digging down, the bright blade going down for the good things. And then he remembers going after his dad when he was a kid, and his dad was digging out potatoes and rooting out the tall tops, and how he picked up the potatoes and loved the feel in his hands. And then he remembers his grandfather digging turf on Toner's Bog, and describes exactly how the schlan, the special spade you use for cutting turf, nestled, the lug of it nestled against the knee, and how his grandfather nicked and sliced and pulled, the turf over and threw it over his shoulder, and was going down and down for the good stuff. And by this time, he's really into it, and he's like bragging about his ancestors and saying, my grandfather cut more turf on Toner's Bog than and he remembers being a little kid and taking out the bottle sloppily corked with paper and everything. And it's beautiful, beautiful account. And there's a series of different kinds of diggings, just all beautifully done, from the potatoes that will nourish you to the deep turf that will warm you. And a sense of generations passing on this art of digging. And then he suddenly pulls back and he says, almost disappointed, like, I wish I could be like that. He says, but I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. And as soon as he gives you that last line, I'll dig with it, you go, oh, and you go back through the poem. And like every one of those perfectly realized, genuinely earthly, unstressed, not contrived images, just exactly what they are, suddenly opens out to you as a way of writing. You begin to see that every one of those kinds of digging is the very art of writing. You're digging, going down and down for the good stuff, and offering people things that they can pick up and always feel in their hands, and the nurturing and the nourishing of a community and a family, and all that stuff is also there in the digging with the pen. And even the image is a gift of his community. He talks in one of his essays, about when he was a lad, and he was obviously a bright lad, and they could see he was going to be a scholar. But, he belonged to this rural farming community. And he'd be trotting along the road, with his little satchel on his way to school. And the men working in the fields with the spades would say, work hard, little Seamus, the pen's lighter than the spade. To encourage. So they'd already made that pen spade thing. I remember I interviewed Heaney when he got the Wilfred Owen Memorial Prize, and then got to know him a little, which was great. And he'd been given this fantastic talk about Wilfred Owen, but this was still with the troubles on, and there was this like vast queue of people, and he sat there with his pen in his hand, and I was just talking to a queue of people ready for him to sign. I said to him, maybe sometimes the pen's heavier than the spade, and I think he saw what it was. But it's a great poem. So there is somebody who glances from earth, but writes a poem which opens up all kinds of things that it's quite difficult to put into words, and he gives them a local habitation and a name. So the Eliot method, heaven to earth, and the Heaney method, earth to heaven, and you can now have a happy half hour mentally slotting all your poets into which way they do that, or which period in their lives they switched over, or whatever. Also, to be fair, because if we're concerned with the art of the poetic imagination, you learn as much from failure as you do, if not more, than you do from success. You can also see, and this is true of other forms of art as well. I'm going to talk about poetry since that's what this is about, and that's my chosen art form. But this would be true, I think, of painting and sculpture and music as well. You can equally see poems that fail, works of art that fail, because they don't make that bridge or connection. They don't do the. So you can see some art and some poetry, to be frank, quite a lot of contemporary poetry, where you know that probably somewhere the poet got some kind of disembodied, abstract thing that they wanted to say, this elusive, peripheral thing. But actually, you don't get it in the poem. The poem never bodies it forth. It never gives it a local habitation or even a name. And it's just disappearing up itself, going round and round and round up there and not getting anywhere, and it just does not deliver. So you have a feeling there's an apprehension, and because you just feel, because Eliot once said that poetry needed at this point in our cultural history to be difficult, because it had to be that there's a bunch of editors out there who think that if it's difficult, it must be poetry. And if it's incomprehensible, it must be really good poetry, And it's out there, but actually this has just failed to deliver. So that's a difficulty at a kind of high cultural end. But you can also see it the other way around. You can see poems that start with the earth and describe, the tree or, whatever it is. This is usually the kind of poetry you find inside greeting cards, but, it does its thing and you go, yes, and like it has delivered everything in one shot. You've comprehended the whole thing on the first reading, and it's not a habitation. There's no doors. There's no windows opening onto anything, yeah? And it doesn't make the bridge, the connection, the ladder between heaven and earth and heaven. It's just earthly, and, it's kind of use and dispose. It's kind of... and then you come across a poem which, even if it starts in the most unpromising way, somehow brings you to this point. So the poem for me, that where you start thinking, well, yeah, and then suddenly you're completely drawn out and you suddenly realize you've entered into a place that has this huge roominess for these apprehensions to come and dwell, that is a habitation which will be many, many times inhabited again and again by the angels you need to hear. For me, that poem, the poem that made me want to be a poet, that sort of first, I thought, oh, this is it. That's what language is. For me, that poem is Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. So I remember being dragged when I was at the school, and I used to, because I couldn't, my parents couldn't afford to fly me home at Easter. So I was farmed out to more or less willing relatives over the Easter. And one of these was an aunt who saw it as her duty to improve me in my holidays. Well, I'd just been working really hard at school. I didn't want to be improved by anybody. But so she would take me around to a lot of museums all the time. And she took me to Keats's house one day, and I thought I was just being dragged off to another dull museum, and I wasn't sure. I mean, I knew Keats without knowing I knew Keats, because my mother used to quote Keats when I was little, but she never said, this is Keats, so you're going to like it. She would just quote it, So I was dragged along to this house and feeling really quite bolshy, and then, then gradually as I walked into the house in Hampstead Heath, I became aware of that this was a very young man, and that he'd been in love with the girl next door, and, and I was a very young man who'd love to be in love with the girl next door, but there wasn't a girl next door because I was in boys' school. But anyway, so I kind of began to think about it a bit. And then they had, there's it's Wentworth Place, there's a room where these big windows, these casements, these French windows open onto the garden, where the tree is, where the nightingale sang. And they had Keats's Ode to a Nightingale written up on the wall, as you imagine. So, while my aunt was going around, I thought, oh, I've got nothing better to do. I suppose I might as well read this dumb poem, And I was kind of quite a depressed teenager, to be honest. And so I started reading this poem, as you know. So it goes, my heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and lethe words had sunk, right? And I'm going, yeah, I'm with you there, man, dull, ache, drains, emptied, sunk. you got me. You know, you got me on drains, you know. So I'm kind of, you know, and if you think about it as just a collection of words, it's pretty much the most unpromising, you know, dull, drains, sunk, you know. And then, so you're there, and then you keep reading, of course, and then you suddenly go, "'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy." Where did this come from? I was startled, wait a minute, I was down here, where's this happiness going? Being too happy in thine happiness, something else's vision, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in a full-throated ease. I'm going, whoa! I didn't even know, like, beech and green and shadows numberless, you know. Like, I didn't even know language could sound like that. It's just so beautiful. And then he draws you out, doesn't he? You know, there's this incredibly sensual verse where it's dark, so he can't see, but he's stepping out into the garden, drawn by the sound of the bird, and he says, "I cannot tell what flowers are at my feet, or what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet." You know, he's drawing you out. I'm really into it. And then, I don't know if you remember, suddenly then he introduces this deep yearning and this homesickness, which comes out of nowhere. He says, I mean, the technical excuse for it is saying, "This nightingale I've heard has been heard by many generations." Maybe, and then suddenly he brings Ruth in. Maybe the same thing found its way into the sad heart of Ruth, when, sick for home, she stood in tears amidst the alien corn. And you're going there. And then suddenly, like in a magical transition, as he's drawn you out of the garden, out into the moonlight, haply the queen moon is on her throne, you know. And then he gives you this image, this deeply resonant biblical image of exile and yearning. And then you find right at the back of the poem that started with those dull doors, you find this magical window. It says, "Such as oft have charmed open magical casements on perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn." He just opens the window for you. And then he draws you back. Forlorn. The very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. You know, and you're back to where you were. But for a moment, as you were drawn through this poem, you found at the back of the poem there was a window or a casement, and you yearned to get onto those perilous seas in the fairy lands forlorn. And you felt like Ruth did, and then you came back. And it was you know, I didn't have the vocabulary for it, but glum 16-year-old standing in Keats's house, for me, it was a transformative spiritual experience. I just knew that there was somewhere at the back of everything, there was a window giving on to perilous seas and fairy. And this poem had become a local habitation and a name. I could go back into that poem reliably whenever I needed to, and I would always find more coming into me and a different kind of, you know. And that, to me, is a perfect example of a poem. It's the earth to heaven, but that really, really opens out. So, okay, just to cut to the chase, as it were. For a long time, I saw this passage about poetry. I knew it very well. I've known this passage. I saw it's entirely about poetry, entirely about everything I've just told you now. I gradually saw more and more that that's what it was. And I've known this since I was, this Shakespeare passage, since I was 17. Because, you know, I mentioned how, you know, Keats was in love with the girl next door, and I didn't have a girl next door to be in love with because I was in this crummy boys' school. And then, unbelievably, when I was 17, just at the right moment, the mythical girls' haberdashers' school, which was on the other side of London that we know, moved next door. And, of course, there was a big high wall between the two schools. But the one thing you were allowed to do together was drama, right? So I immediately signed up for the drama course. And guess what our play was? It was Midsummer Night's Dream. And I got to be Puck. You know, it's the story of my life. I was once a young, lithe Puck, and now I'm an aging Falstaff. But, you know, it was great while it lasted. And, of course, that whole play has the wall. Thou, oh, wall, show me thy chink to blink through with mine eye. And I did indeed fall in love with a girl who happened to be playing Hippolyta. So I was really jealous of Theseus, and you know, and I watched with intensity all the rehearsals in which this scene took place. So I knew this speech for sort of deeply personal reasons. I could say that way better. I should so be Theseus, you know. So I knew this thing from when I was 17, right? And now I'm 61. You know, it's been with me all that time. But it was only around that time that we met at St Andrews in 2002 that I began to think through, how does my passion for poetry and my faith, how do these meet? Where is the theology? How is it happening, right? And I began to sketch out the possibility that I might write a book called Faith, Hope and Poetry and try and talk about theology and the poetic imagination, right? So I thought, well, I better just remind myself what poetry is before I start talking about theology. So I came back to this passage, but I came back to this passage having done a huge amount of thinking about the nature of the incarnation, about John's gospel, about the creeds, and having all that stuff there. And I thought, golly, how could I have been so dumb? I realized as soon as I read this again that I think without question, Shakespeare is riffing on the prologue to John's gospel, and indeed also on the Nicene Creed. So if you think about John's gospel for a minute, if you think about the beginning, in archein logos, kai logos en proston, so in the beginning, or in principio verbum, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was with God in the beginning. All things were made through him. It's great. You know when you read that, oh my God, this is brilliant mystical theology. But you can't get hold of it at all. Like, you can't get it in your mind. It's just going round and round. It's fabulous. But you're going like, where do I come in? You know, like sort of, you know, on a hot August day, what's that got to do? And then, of course, you get to verse 14, and you say, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld, we saw, we looked, we glanced. We beheld his glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And yet we beheld it in the physicality of the body. Imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. And what is it? A local habitation and a name. And of course, Shakespeare, as you know, when he's writing this play in the late 16th century, in the 1590s, so he's not reading the authorized version, doesn't come till 1611, and he's got his small Latin and less Greek, but he's being a bit too modest. He's got plenty of Latin. Although the bishop's Bible was available and the king's Bible, and also probably might have snuck over a few hot copies of the Geneva Bible. If you take the Shakespeare was really a Catholic view, he probably had the Dewey, whatever. He had plenty around, but he certainly would have heard preachers use the Latin as well. I mean, Lancelot Andrewes, the greatest preacher of his age, always gives you the text in Latin as well as in English. So he would have known the prologue to John's Gospel in Latin, certainly as well as in English. And he would have remembered, not only verbum, caro, factum est, you know, but also the first question of the disciples to Jesus, which in the AV is, Master, where are you staying? To which Jesus replies, come and see. Of course, in the Vulgate is Magister ubi habitat. Habitat. Where is your habitation? Where is your local habitation? And soon we're going to discover what is your name. And the answer is see. The poet's eye doth glance. Come and see. And I think just gently, quietly, part of all the kind of ironic humor, this is set BC, right? So this is a pre-Christian play. And I have a theory that all of Shakespeare's plays set BC are his most mischievously Christian plays. He's constantly teasing you with stuff he puts into the mouths of people before Christ, which only Christ can really unlock. But they say it anyway. Like in King Lear, you know, when Lear exposes himself on the, you know, and is utterly to all the pelting of the pitiless rain and everything. And he says, take physic pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel. Then would you shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just. That the heavens will only be shown just when there is a king who is utterly naked to the worst that the world can throw at him. And that will be the justice of the heavens, you know, and you're going, it's coming, you know. You haven't got it yet, but it's coming. So I think Shakespeare is gently putting into the mouth of Theseus an account of poetry which depends on the Johannine account of how the word itself is made flesh in Christ. And I think, whether Shakespeare meant it or not, I would want to contend that all our poetic making and shaping, and of course, if you go back to the Greek, we don't know how much Greek Shakespeare really had, but the Greek word for verb to make, as I'm sure you all know, is poiein, right? Okay. So without him was not anything made that was made. It's, you would say was poetry. Poiein, it's made. A poet is a maker. So God's poetry of making it is through the word. The word is spake as we did not. It speaks things into being. But great poetry wants to do more than just speak things into being, but it wants to be inside the being of the things that it's spoken into being, to be made flesh. So everything that is, and of course the light shines, the darkness has not comprehended it. So everything, the whole entire only apprehensible mystery of the being and love of God, and especially of the eternally begotten Son, is bodied forth for us. And when we meet him in Christ in his local habitation name, every time, if every time I go into the Ode to a Nightingale, I find more to look at and more shining to me from heaven through those magical casements open on, how much more so when I come into the mystery who is Christ. And also, if I'm made in the image of God, and I'm made, as Tolkien, as you all know, I'm sure, famously says in the Mythopoeia poem, we make still by the law by which we're made. Then I'm naturally going to want to make like that and body forth like that. So that, at the core, is how I would say I think the link is between the poetic imagination on the one hand and the incarnation on the other. But you'll see there's a couple of things I haven't given you. I just want to throw out, particularly because we've got our pastors here, but a lot of you and ministers. It goes without saying from what I've said that the kind of poetry which really bodies forth what could only be apprehended is exactly the kind of poetry we need in church and the kind of poetry we need in preaching. And we shouldn't be afraid of that, and we shouldn't be afraid of getting the thing to be really earthly and incarnate. And I threw in here from Edwin Muir some passages, not the whole of it, from Edwin Muir's poem, the Scottish mystical poet, the incarnate one, almost as a warning to all of us, right? I'm sure this never happens in any of your churches, but Muir records an early experience as a child of bad church, okay? He asks the question, I won't do the whole thing, but towards the end of that first stanza, he says, how could our race, i.e. the Scots, who ought to have been, of all the Celtic peoples, the most good at embodying apprehension, you know, and having an almost sixth sense of how the mortal and the physical is shot through with the glory of God. That's what the Celts do. You know, how could our race, of all races, betray the image and the incarnate one unmake, who chose this form and fashion for our sake? And then this is his description of bad church. The word made flesh is here made word again. A word made word in flourish and arrogant crook. See there, King Calvin with his iron pen, and God, 3 angry letters in a book. And there, the logical hook on which the mystery is impaled and bent into an ideological argument. There's better gospel in man's natural tongue. And truer sight was theirs outside the law, who saw the far side of the cross among the archaic peoples in their ancient awe. In ignorant wonder saw the wooden cross tree on the bare hillside, not knowing that there a God suffered and died. He's actually saying the people who didn't have the advantage of the beautiful theology and the fabulously exact models of the atonement, which you've forgotten are only models, you know, that they can somehow see the cross more than we can. And we need to, as it were, willingly suspend our belief from it and just see the cross. Then let the theology come, you know, bodied forth out of that. So he then goes on to say, the fleshless word growing, this is prophecy, the fleshless word growing will bring us down. Pagan and Christian man alike will fall, the auguries say. The white and black and brown, the merry and the sad, theorist, lover, all invisibly will fall. Abstract calamity, save for those who can build their cold empire on the abstract man. There's a terrible way in which the very thing that might have been the means of bodying and communication, the internet, the whole thing, is itself part of that abstract calamity and that cold empire and that disembodying. So the call for poetry to be a bodying forth, the call for preaching to be a bodying forth. So I know I'll close with this poem. This is, just I threw this in myself, this is about my own experience of receiving communion, but it seemed to me to say something perhaps about how the incarnation continues. So this is called Love's Choice. This bread is light, dissolving, almost air. A little visitation on my tongue. A wafer-thin sensation, hardly there. This taste of wine is brief in flavour, flung a moment at the palate's roof and fled. Even its aftertaste a memory. Yet, this is how he comes. Through wine and bread, love chooses to be emptied into me. He does not come in unimagined light, too bright to be denied, too absolute for consciousness, too strong for sight, leaving the seer blind, the poet mute. Chooses instead to seep into each sense, to die himself into experience. I'll stop there. I've overrun. Thanks for listening.